The cracked gray structure stood like a monument before them, separated from the off-road only by a chain-link fence, scattering pockets of moonlight over the foursome. Swaying against each other with inebriation, 3 frat boys and the only girl they could find who had the balls to come up to this place stood agape before it like they couldn't believe that their feet had brought them so far away from the campus parties and the city lights. "Don't you think somebody still owns this place?" the girl asked them. Her name was Allison, a freckled brunette, and to be fair, she was drunk too, but she wasn't stupid. "It's still like a private property or something, and there could be security we don't know about." "Here?" retorted Lance with a snort of laughter. "Yeah, I bet they have state-of-the-art cameras." With a boost from his friends, he clambered his bulk up and over the fence in what seemed like a single motion. Quite an athlete Lance was. Broad in the shoulders and the boldest of them all yet, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was a bit off once his feet touched the ground. Not that he could ever let it slip. The grip on his reputation as a fraternity storyteller and man of the world was a tenuous one at best. "Alright guys, I don't hear no alarms and shit going off. Come on over." Mikey, a tall scarecrow of a boy with dangly sandy curls to match, gestured to Allison. Ladies first?" She rolled her eyes and began climbing. His gaze darted across her tight jeans and slender frame, too drunk to make a secret of the fact that he was hoping to get lucky. After all, it was New Year's Eve and most of the girls had gone home for the holiday, so it seemed like as good of a time as any. When she reached the other side, Mikey was next over the rusty barricade. Their last one on the party felt most hesitant of all, even if it didn't show in his smirking young face. Junior, as his friends called him, was only a sophomore, and although Lance had famously made many daring journeys to places strange and spooky, this was Junior's first. But he didn't want to be labeled a pussy, so he shrugged off the feeling of uncertainty and made his way over to the chain-link fence just in time for Lance to begin weaving one of his grand old tales. "There's a reason, guys, that this building, out of the whole facility, is the one that no one, and I mean no one, is brave enough to step inside." Allison heaved a big sigh. "You know that my mother warned me never to get into haunted houses with strange men." Mikey laughed, if a little too forcefully. "But it isn't a haunted house. Well, not in the traditional sense." "Traditional sense?" Junior piped up. Unlike the others, he had a genuine interest in history. And not only that, but the building really did seem to emanate something. It gave off that feeling, what some might call déjà vu, or the chill they say you get when someone passes over your grave. Well, it was a house of sorts. I mean, somebody lived here. But just one man. One single, solitary, mysterious man. "Oh God!" Allison was less than impressed. "Was he an axe murderer? Did he eat people? I went to summer camp. These aren't new stories. Look at this shack, I guess. It's a piece of a hallway off an outbuilding that cut off from the rest of the hospital. And you notice anything else?" He waved his impressive wingspan around the facade of the building with a dramatic flair. "You know, there was a fire here in '74. Mikey shrugged. "Yeah, the whole place burned down, right?" "Well, the hospital had to close. They wouldn't have had a patient in here, and if there was, they would have." Junior wanted to add something of his own, but his voice trailed off, as his eyes were drawn to the outside walls of the chip cement home, for lack of a better term. It wasn't scorched or fallen down in blackened beams leaning against each other like the rest of the structures in the hospital. It was unsullied. It almost seemed pristine by comparison. Lance lowered his voice and let the eerie feeling set in. Why would they lock one man in here all alone, when there were all manner of sick and crazy people to house him with? And why is it still standing here, completely untouched, while the rest of the hospital crumpled down all around it? He leaned back nonchalantly against an old tree trunk, satisfied with himself, and began to speak in a low monotone. "I see windows. Boarded up, sure, but they're there. But what I don't see... a door," Mikey said breathlessly. He had spotted something and he was sure of it. "Is that the door? Guys, look!" It was hard to tell even with a good amount of light shining down on them. And like any good millennials, they whipped out their phones and began a hesitant approach towards the old building. their digital flashlights held up like shields before them. But he had to be right. The shape Mikey was gesturing to did seem like the size and outline of a door, and yet it had been perfectly painted over. No, more like sealed over long ago, and it was the same color as the rest. But as he slid his nimble fingers over the surface, dust and grime notwithstanding, he could feel the frame. The rest of the adventuring party followed suit, save for Lance, who kept his distance back at the trees. And maybe it was all of his previous journeys out to the haunted houses, or just the melodrama he kept bubbling below the surface of his legends. But something felt wrong about this place in his bones. Allison was more enthusiastic, more brave even. She turned eagerly, back in confirmation. "He's right, there's a door here. Come look." She pointed to the one other curious feature. After a bit of probing and close examination revealed itself. The door had a narrow hole right in the center of it, like a mail slot. She knocked, and behind it, the hollow space rattled back at her. Allison shivered at the touch and, along with Mikey and Junior, took a few steps back from the building. After a moment, Lance finally spoke again, breaking the crisp and quiet night air. "Alright, so there's a door. We made it this far. The question is now, who wants to go inside?" Nurse's log, December the 10th, 1891. Patient name, Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes. Mr. Sullivan is a white man, young in age, which cannot be approximated due to the lack of documentation, as well as his continued delusions of a fantasy world he believes exists. After suddenly entering the facility unsteady on his feet, found to be sweating and in a daze. His words have been garbled and made very few, if any, facts apparent. He has been consistently uncooperative, even under the treatment of sedatives and psychiatric care, and given any explanation as his unusual complexion and skin condition, which in the last few days after being committed to this facility has proceeded to spread over much of his body. Symptoms of dry coughing, spasms, and fever indicate a possible resurgence of the recent influenza pandemic, forcing the care physician, Dr. Hill, to move Mr. Sullivan to the quarantine ward at this time, until further study can be conducted. The standard treatments for delusional hysteria remain as usual. And notes. You expect us to go in there? Come on, Lance. Allison moaned and pulled her jacket tighter around her. There's a million other ways to celebrate New Year's, and I'm pretty sure that the party you dragged us from was one of them. Well, they do say that it has to be New Year's to see him. There's something special about it. Lance stood up straight and gave the best stern look you can muster while drunk. It's a timing thing, okay? So, you're going in then, I assume. She shot back. Wait, see who? Mikey narrowed his eyes in skepticism. To see the crazy got stuck in a shack guy. How the hell are we supposed to do that? He couldn't get his mind off of that creepy door. That barely there opening to the outside world. Who on earth would you trap in such an ungodly place? And how was he supposed to be alive after all this time and nobody to attend to him? Mikey certainly wasn't fool enough to go in. Junior stood in thought for a moment. So the man they kept in here, what's so creepy about that? I mean, maybe he was just a pervert or a leper or something, and they didn't want him to be around everybody else. Lance, dude, he's gotta be dead by now. Nobody comes around here anymore. It's a goddamn ghost story, man. That's the whole point. Lance steadied himself and took a couple steps towards the rest of them. This guy, right? They said he had some kind of, a virus or something. But the thing is, it didn't touch him. It was getting everybody else sick from being around him. He smirked and hoped he was getting to them. Even as that nagging feeling on the back of his mind told him then it was getting to him too. And that maybe stepping foot in the old place wasn't the best of suggestions. So eventually, he did die. And on New Year's Eve, tonight. Okay, if you look through those old boarded up windows. He pointed at the narrow slits between the planks through which two tall windows could be seen. You'll see him in there. A buddy of mine did. People had before. He comes every year. He let his story fade down into an uncomfortable nod, twisting all of their stomachs as they made an uneasy glance at the building. Mike instinctively took a step away. Lance, if there's a freaking virus in there or something, we could let it out and all get sick. That door stayed shut for a reason, man. I mean, do contagious things live that long? His eyes, now gone wild and wide sky blue, made their way around the circle of kids in a dash of paranoia. No way, Allison butted in. You said people were here before and they saw this. The sick guy, right? And Lance nodded. Then it would have gotten out already. Junior cleared his throat and decided to have a go at it. She's right, on New Year's, you said. And check the windows. Behind the thin slats of wood, they could see broken out panels of glass, covered in filth and occasionally whistling in the breeze. There's no contagion. His curiosity had got the better of him, and his voice gained courage with a kind of ambition, like he was a man with something to prove. So then, tell us how it works. Okay, Lance continued, leaning into his little group. You can see him. Actually see him inside trying to find a way out of there. Like he never escaped. I'm telling you, man, it's the fucking truth. You go to the windows and just gotta I don't know, call him out. And then just wait and watch him from there. So, nobody's going in then, Allison said with a hint of disappointment. Waiting to catch a glimpse of a locked up ghost. Wow, this is stupid. I'm going back to the party. She began to make her way back to the fence. Junior didn't want to miss his chance to look brave and cool in front of a pretty girl, even though it did give him the creeps. Surely opening up the door and stepping inside would be ballsy in her eyes. I'll go in, he half whispered. I mean, yeah, I don't believe in ghosts. Fuck it. What's the worst that could be in there? A couple of hobos and some rats? He puffed himself up with every moment that passed until he was determined to step foot inside. Junior, it could actually be dangerous in there. It was working and she truly was worried for him. These guys are being dumbasses and you don't have to do it. She bit her lower lip and wandered slowly back to the group. No way, he's got the right idea. Lance smiled, if a bit uneasily. I'll even go in after you. Oh, real brave of you, Allison quipped. And then she turned to Junior, matted dark hair in the face of a stoic hero as he steeled himself in front of the mysterious building. Just be careful, dude. Use the light of your phone, it's pretty fucking dark in there. She even put her hand on his arm and a feeling of warmth spread through his body. Take some pictures, man, Mikey chimed in. If this is for real, it's shit I want to be able to prove. As if driven to do so, he too clapped Junior on the shoulder with an attaboy sort of look, if only to save himself from being the one to go in alone. Junior stepped to the now just visible door, and suddenly his stomach dropped out so forcefully he felt sick, and not just from the booze. Something emanated from this place and it felt like another world he was edging towards, though he wasn't sure if it was an evil one. A crazy plague man, out of time, alone in his shack. The hairs at the back of his neck stood on end like the air was pure electricity. But all the same, he wasn't one to go back on his word, and he was more than ready to find out. It took some prying and he had to remove his gloves just to get his nails in beneath the coats of paint and bits of lacquer haphazardly dashed across the door. But finally, he had opened it. With his flashlight app on and a final glance back at his friends, he slowly entered the dingy one-room shack. And suddenly, a chill ran through him as his sneakers trudged unsuredly across the threshold. At first, Junior was fairly underwhelmed by what he saw inside. It was dirty, a sparsely furnished den of sorts, and it seemed long abandoned from what he saw by the light of his phone. Based on the leftmost wall, he saw where it might have been once attached to the rest of the hospital, and as he went over to investigate, he discovered loose boards beneath his feet. Looking around unsurely, he knelt down to knock at the hollow space, and then slowly pried up a plank. Junior didn't know why, but it seemed cozy. Like there was an actual home down there, a place where you might lay your head. It was a little cubby, sort of a hidey hole, just big enough for somebody to huddle inside. Plus it seemed that no one else had ever found it before. But the wood had held a lot stronger than he anticipated, and with a great snap, a chunk suddenly broke off into his hand and sent him backwards. tripping over the boards with the sound of a crunch from his phone echoing off the walls before he landed on his back. Nurse's log, December the 21st. Patient name, Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes. Mr. Sullivan's health has declined sharply given his repeated refusal of medications, and as of today, he has entered a semi-catatonic state. Dr. Hill suggests a form of psychiatric examination and has consulted with Dr. Warren and Ebb in an attempt to further study these curious traits. The rash, seemingly bilious in nature, continues to spread. It is feared that the poor man may not live to see the new year, considering his rather deplorable circumstances, and feared even more so that he was the cause of an unusual number of deaths in the very quarantine hall that he had been placed in. Indeed, the patient, when on the occasion he speaks, seems to wish himself dead, and expresses a complete lack of understanding in regard to the deaths of his fellow patients. We had hoped that despite no one coming forward as of yet, as it is nearing Christmas time, some family might come to inquire after Mr. Sullivan. Before he stopped communicating completely, however, amidst his ranting, he insisted that his companions were in fact the ones who constrained him to this institution in the first place. And notes. Junior pulled himself back into semi-consciousness and found himself in a strange new environment, sharp and bright as he allowed his eyes to adjust. He'd hit the back of his head and upon the pillow what felt like matted blood stuck in his hair. They must have taken him to urgent care or something. It was like a dream, and the room he was in swam before his vision in a haze of white and gray. Did they give him medicine? He itched like hell. He tried getting up only to find himself, to his horror, in rubber-brown restraints strapped to a gurney. Frantically he looked around him, rows of beds cleanly dressed with white linen and empty. Nothing, no one. He cried out in frustration. "Hello, hello! Please, can somebody tell me where I am?" His pleas were only met with silence. He saw that he was in a strange dressing gown, also white, and he wondered what they had done with his clothes, his friends, with anything as far as he was concerned. He had nearly resigned himself to just lying there and going back to sleep when he heard footsteps approaching. Lifting his head, Junior could see two doctors in suits and bow ties, one of them wearing gloves and a nurse in a large heavy apron a good distance away from him, seemingly watching him and remarking to one another. They stayed quite a ways from him and kept glancing over nervously before continuing to talk in hushed tones. "Please," Junior demanded. "Please, just tell me what's happening." The nurse gave him a scant look of concern, and then continued conferring with her colleagues, who seemed to ignore him entirely. They began walking away. No, don't! You have to help me!" His heart thumped wildly in his chest as he lay back, staring up at the cold white ceiling as he struggled to hang on to consciousness. Allison was the first in the group to stand up from their seated half circle and look at her phone. "He's been in there for a while, guys. Somebody needs to go check that he's okay. I thought that I heard a noise." "Are you kidding me? He's just trying to scare us," Lance said, his voice filled with false bravado. "I bet any second." Mike jumped to his feet. "Wait, look, I see something." He craned his long neck for a better view between the wooden slats. "Junior?" Allison ventured. "I think it's him, thank God." Junior was sedated. The nurse had injected him behind a veil of plastic sheeting and, by now, he had utterly no idea where his head was at. The two doctors, both now heavily weighed down by thick gown-like garments and surgical gloves, said through heavy rubber masks, "This is the second time and I haven't seen the slightest inclination as to how." "How he got out? Clearly the man's a plague bringer. His mind is addled, worrying. That's why you know what we must do, what steps must be taken. This has gone on long enough." The young man tried in vain to protest, slurring and mumbling, as they dragged him down a narrow hall sparsely lit and onto a decrepit cot in a dark room. Sleep took hold of him, and somewhere in the darkness, a door slammed shut and the sounds of rivets, boards, and whispers drifted quietly away amidst his foggy slumber. "Holy fuck!" Lance practically screamed as the door slammed shut on its own accord. He leaped up and raced towards the old gray shack and the occasional movement that could be seen just between those gaps in the window boards. Mikey shrugged off his sense of foreboding and ran to the door. It won't budge, it's like it was sealed back over again. I can't get it. His friend joined him in trying to pry it open any way they could, desperately searching for tools or objects that might free him, while Allison went to the window in a panic. Junior, can you hear me? Junior, Sully. Inside he gave a groggy half smile at the sound of his name. It was kind of nice, he thought. Nobody ever called him that. Allison whipped her head around and frantically gestured at Mikey. Sully, Mike, he's just laying there. The window's too high for me to reach. Come on, please. The two convened at the window, struggling to catch any glimpse of their trapped companion. Inside, the beleaguered young man trembling stared to his feet and was immediately floored by the horror of his realization. He was back in that old boarded-up room again, except it was far from the place he remembered. The paint newer, the furniture cleaner, and the windows, they had bars on them. And as he approached, he was only barely tall enough to see through them. He thought to find something on him, anything. But as he patted down his body, he only discovered that he was in another plain hospital smock, one that contrasted against the blotchy red discoloration spread all over his arms. But Allison, he could hear her voice, echoing through the chamber. She was on the other side of the window. She must be. Junior's mind reeled, and yet he clung to the only things he could fully grasp. The bars on the windows, and the notion of his friends outside, ready to save him from this monstrous hell. A hell that seemed so familiar and yet so wrong. He was wrong. This was all wrong. Were they his friends? Were they even there at all? He fought hard against his growing delirium. The faint sound of fireworks going off in the distance hardly served to deter Allison, who was hoisted up wobbling by Mikey and Lance as she took care not to cut herself, reaching through the long ruined window and one of the few holes big enough to get her arm through. She called to him desperately. Sully, come on, we're getting you out of here. And not she, not Mikey, nor even Lance had the heart to tell him that what they were seeing from the outside utterly horrified them in the same primal, confused way his own surroundings did. They could only see him older, with mottled and burnt-looking skin, and a tattered gown drapely loosing over his skeletal frame. He reached for the window as best he could, but he felt so terribly exhausted. Sully looked back at the floor behind him. There was a pattern of uneven boards, and he remembered his special spot down there. A place where he didn't have to face any of this, where he could be comfortable, and just sit and think for a while. It was almost like going home, waking up from a nightmare that couldn't really happen. He half shuffled and half crawled down into the hard panel flooring, as the voices he seemed to dream calling his name began to fade. What's he doing? I can't see him anymore. Lance and Mikey lowered the girl back down as they shared disturbed glances, and a feeling of utter hopelessness came over them. As if on cue, the grand finale of the city fireworks went off with a cacophony of pops and shrieks. All three of them ran to the door in a frenzy, smashing and kicking it wildly until all at once it creaked open. Trembling with uncertainty, Lance put forth his phone, bathing the dusty old room with light. Holding hands, the three went in together. Sully. There was no reply. Junior, dude, where are you? Mikey offered, and his clammy hand gripped Allison's once more before letting go. After a few tentative steps alleviated the paranoia, they separated to search every possible nook and cranny, which ended in a stumble followed by a loud scream. Nurse's log. January the 1st. Patient name, Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes. It is my sad duty to conclude the patient file of Mr. Sullivan, as, after much deliberation, the chief medical staff and attending physicians all agreed that he must, himself, be quarantined from the rest of the world. Most alarmingly, Mr. Sullivan shows no observable signs of direct harm from whatever contagion he harbors, and yet it managed to infect and kill not only every other soul in the quarantine ward, but a dozen others outside of it, including 2 nurses and a small child. If this is indeed a variation of a flu disaster, then inhumane as it may seem, it appears there are no other options for this unfortunate man than to seal him away in the storage outbuilding for fear of greater epidemic. In accordance with viral disease protocols, this institution and its staff will do their best to accommodate food and drinking water for this man until such time as he cannot or will not cooperate. His remaining personal effects, incinerated to destroy contagion, were as follows. 1 pair of Levi Strauss denim trousers, 1 oddly colorful linen shirt, 1 pair of lacing shoes, 1 woolen button jacket, 1 pair of socks and 1 glass device, possibly a type of mirror or photographic cartridge, thoroughly dashed to pieces when Mr. Sullivan was admitted. This is the final status report of patient Miles Sullivan. The year of our Lord, 1892. End notes. Allison recoiled in horror as she found herself half fallen into a small cubbyhole of sorts, seated snugly beneath the floorboards, containing a single human skeleton in a tattered old gown, curled awkwardly into the fetal position, and resting just against her leg.